So I have talk about an impossible position. I have the unenviable task of following this dream team of this morning. And of course I'll dispense with the red carpet, other than to say I'm Margaret MacNamidhe, I'm visiting from Chicago. And of course I want to thank ICANN for this marvellously organised and important occasion this weekend. So thank you very much, Ike. Despite all the new work on Delacroix, amply represented by the scholars in this room, work on his different phases remains unevenly distributed. I believe that unevenness is more than an ordinary result of growing scholarship. I think that it is also symptomatic of several deeply embedded traditions in the reception of Delacroix's work. In particular, I think that a previously unnoticed inability to settle upon a series of works as representative of his painting in general has characterized some leading traditions of commentary on the artist. In the first chapter of my forthcoming book, I examine responses to Delacroix, including 19th century accounts by Stendhal, Charles Baudelaire, and Paul Signac, as well as 20th century commentaries by Clement Greenberg, Thomas Crowe, Jonathan Crary, and others. Here I will just concentrate on one part of the first chapter. That sounds awful. Is that okay? Do I need to? I think is this one of the fissures that Darcy was talking about?
You did.
Okay. My aim in that chapter is to suggest the existence of an unexamined interpretive tradition of responses to Delacroix's painting that depends only on dispersed examples. My inquiry in that chapter also addresses the long-standing claim for the priority of depicted action in Delacroix's painting. That priority cannot be read, for example, in Baudelaire's responses. Baudelaire juxtaposed different figures from different paintings painted decades apart within the same sentence. At one point in his Salon of 1846, he proceeds back in time from a figure painted in 1840 to one painted 16 years earlier. The Crusaders entering Constantinople gave him the figure of, quote, a kneeling woman with her hair cast down in the foreground, unquote, which he instantly followed by the invocation of the, quote, old woman, so wrinkled and forlorn, unquote, depicted in the foreground of the scenes from the massacres of Chios of 1824. These peculiarities of judgment are symptomatic, both in Baudelaire and in other figures such as Signac, that I don't have time to talk about here. If there is a tendency to assess Delacroix's painting overall in dispersed, synchronic ways, why hasn't it been previously taken as a critical problem? The reason, I think, bears on the now stranded sense of the term French Romanticism in relation to Delacroix. The tendency to concentrate on Delacroix's work of the 1820s and early 1830s as representative is well established. It has also masked the continuities in response I trace in the book. Although the designation of Delacroix's representative painting as synonymous with the first 20 or so years of his career became increasingly automatic as the 20th century wore on, the presumptions behind it were largely generated, as Stephen Bann has discussed, by Léon Rosenthal's categorizations in his book Romantic Painting of 1914. Bann has described how Delacroix was only the most prominent of the painters who inconveniently outlived the time frame for Romanticism in French painting, originally allotted by Rosenthal. Although the specificity of Rosenthal as a source was increasingly eroded in later 20th century scholarship, the priority of the decade of the 1820s and just beyond, as defining of Delacroix's work in general, became established. Baudelaire had also taken Delacroix's work to signify as a whole, but his response had remained unmarked by a contradiction arising from the privileging of one period. In the Salon of 1846, Baudelaire listed the following, quote, succession, unquote, of works. then this is a quote, Dante and Virgil, the massacre at Chios, Sardanapalus, Christ in the Garden of Olives, Saint Sebastian, Medea, the shipwreck of Don Juan, the Hamlet, the Crusaders entering Constantinople, and the women of Algiers, unquote. Because it didn't occur to Baudelaire to stop listing works made after the, quote, mid-1830s, unquote, his, quote, succession, unquote, which included paintings which have subsequently largely slipped below the horizon of art historical interest, for example, the Constantinople and the Hamlet. But Baudelaire's succession, I would argue, doesn't function as a selection of Delacroix's representative paintings. In fact, Baudelaire couldn't have made such a list. It would have proved unmanageably large. That is because of the extent to which he responded to the evocative power of certain works by Delacroix and to parts of works. Musing on any potentially representative individual figure in a painting was liable to prompt thoughts of other figures, including some not by Delacroix. Baudelaire's response to Delacroix can initially be appreciated within the context of the best-known discussion of that response, Michael Fried's account of what he calls the memory structure of Western painting and sculpture in Baudelaire's Salon of 1846. Here, I want to integrate this concept into my own argument about a tradition of unevenness of attention to Delacroix. By memory structure, Fried means the centuries-old recourse made by Western artists to classical, Renaissance, and post-Renaissance traditions as constantly mined sources of reusable expressions, poses, and composition. Although Fried's analysis of Baudelaire's response to Delacroix is not the main point of his essay, the Salon of 1846 provided Fried with his leading example of the operation of the memory structure because of the elaborate pains Baudelaire took, they were justificatory and convoluted, to assure himself that his favorite artist's achievement was both reinforced from afar and mercifully precedent-free, exactly because Delacroix's multi-figure paintings were riddled with poses, expressions, and anatomical templates taken from the old masters. In Fried's reading, Baudelaire wanted these traditions kept at bay, at a reinforcing, evocative remove from any individual painting. The potential baselessness Fried describes led to the difficulties that plagued Baudelaire when he attempted to create an interpretative equilibrium for Delacroix's paintings. This aspect of Fried's essay is, I think, plausible. But I'm more interested in the ferociously unstable, endlessly ramifying nature of Baudelaire's original perception of an individual painting in any particular case. The depth of the memory structure is the reason why, once it is considered alongside other bodies of evidence, Baudelaire's excerpting during his Salon of 1846 of two figures, one from the Constantinople and the other from the Chios, offers the potential to reconcile the two apparently different versions of Delacroix. On the one hand, there is the diffuse, non-locatable artist, who nevertheless has a reputation for completion. On the other, there is a painter whose greatest effects lingered in parts, pieces, or isolated figures. According to Baudelaire, quote, in several paintings by Delacroix, by some strange and recurring accident, you will find one figure which is more stricken, more crushed than the others, a figure in which all the surrounding anguish is epitomized, unquote. For Baudelaire, such a figure conveyed a despondency so deeply etched as to concentrate the generalized suffering of his or her companions. But if the softly painted forms of Baudelaire's first, but chronologically later, figure, with her slumped back and shadowed, brushed-in profile, generally conform to a conventional evocation of passivity, most other commentators on the earlier figure, which you see on your right, saw neither the wrinkled face nor the crushed dejection Baudelaire described. In 1824, the critic Alphonse Rabe described the old woman's sharply drawn face as, quote, fleshless, unquote, while Adolphe Thiers, whose prescient admiration for the young Delacroix was extolled by Baudelaire, identified a, quote, startled old woman who looked terrified, unquote. More intriguing still is the response to this figure by Léon Cogniet, a now obscure artist whose later career has been recently re-examined by Mark Gottlieb. At the beginning of that career, however, Cogniet was a close peer of Delacroix. Although he concentrated on the exact same figure later isolated by Baudelaire, Cogniet waxed enthusiastic about the obvious way in which the old woman improved on the art of the past. Cogniet's remarks, made during a visit to Delacroix's studio to see the kiosk, were recorded by Delacroix in the journal. Cogniet said that, and this is a quote, he felt as though he were seeing the beginnings of a picture, that is the kiosk, of the great period. And then he said how much Géricault would have liked it. The old woman without a gaping mouth, whose eyes aren't exaggerated, unquote. By excerpting not a focal figure, but one depicted just off center, Cogniet included himself in the tradition of appreciative viewers lighting upon secondary parts of Delacroix's paintings. His invocation of the recently deceased Géricault, in whose shadow Cogniet also emerged as a painter, is unsurprising as well. A look at the middle ground of the raft reveals figures tilted in ways also seen in Delacroix's figure. Here, Delacroix's recourse to Géricault's composition seems to accrue further localized depths. In addition, a series of other faces Delacroix painted in a number of otherwise diverse canvases from the years 1820 to 1824 show him fascinated by the potential of this very expression, a face caught in an alerted, upturned angle. Not surprisingly then, Hal Foster, in his discussion of Fried's concept of the memory structure, has argued that Baudelaire, drew on, quote, the persistence of Géricault's raft in Delacroix's work of the 1820s as a kind of subtextuality of mnemonic after-images, unquote. This direction, also found in Crowe's assessments of Delacroix, proceeds straight back to the raft from works such as the Kiosk or Dante and Virgil in Hell. A familiar marker signals the trail's end, emphasizing the extent of Delacroix's dependence on Géricault. But this only deepens the need to explain the terms of Baudelaire's memory of the old woman in the kiosk. That is because, in this instance, the trail leads from faces marked by an active expressivity quintessentially Géricaultian in its imagining to a figure resolutely described by Baudelaire as crushed. I believe that Cogniet's response to this particular figure in the kiosk can explain this apparent anomaly. Cogniet greeted this figure, this face, with cheery approval. He even expressed relief. Why was this the case? Kallmyer's words indicated that his relief stemmed from Delacroix's omission of a gaping mouth from the old woman he portrayed in the kiosk. In other words, Kallmyer immediately spotted a change made by Delacroix to a source. He wasted no time in conveying his enthusiasm about Delacroix's variation on the theme. A delighted shorthand record quickly made its way into the journal. In fact, the whole exchange between these fellow artists about the figure of the old woman was probably over in minutes. Over the course of a visit to another painter preparing for the salon, Kallmyer showed how much the citational role played by precedent in the figure of the old woman, unacceptable to Baudelaire, was part and parcel of studio practice. Géricault's is the only name mentioned in the journal's entry about Kallmyer's compliment, and this accords perfectly with how pervasive the raft is in the work of Delacroix's first decade as an exhibiting artist. But it's vital to note how Kallmyer glimpsed a longer lineage for the kiosk's figure, one that included the 17th century artists Guido Reni and Nicolas Poussin. Here are the two paintings in question, along with details of the figures that you see here. Foster's memory structure then thus departs somewhat from Fried's analysis of the Salon of 1846. Baudelaire rested secure in Delacroix's invocation of the art of the past. That was because he believed it to be heedless. It was the force of the involuntary that allowed Delacroix his access to tradition, and Géricault was only a recent representative of many traditions. To be sure, the raft might offer itself as an initial after-image in the major paintings of Delacroix's early career. But it has plenty of company. Distraught mothers in full cry are depicted in the famous versions of the Massacre of the Innocents by Reni and Poussin. Reni's canvas of 1611, a detail of which you see on the left, was painted 15 or 16 years before Poussin's version of the same subject, visible on your right. Delacroix withheld the motif of O-shaped lips parted in the evocation of sound. And here we find the reason for Kallmyer's delighted relief. Delacroix had spared him, Kallmyer, a frozen moment of endless wailing. Kallmyer, I believe, made his admiration for the expressive effect of a closed mouth evident in his own painting. Nonetheless, he followed a direction entirely contrary to the one he had seen Delacroix take. At the time he visited Delacroix's studio, Kallmyer was working on his own version of the Massacre of the Innocents. Frozen with fear, the fleeing mother he depicted at its center has collapsed against a wall to snatch an opportunity of temporary refuge from Herod's soldiers. Kallmyer gave her exactly the same seated pose he had seen Delacroix use for the figure of the old woman, down to the outward turning soles of her crisscrossed feet. The angle of her knees points in the opposite direction to the knees of Delacroix's figure. The young mother we see is shown clasping a hand across her terrified child's mouth. Her fingers displace his lips. In the case of Kallmyer's favorite figure from the kiosk, a closed mouth had sealed the heightened sense of inner drama her expression conveyed. In 1846, Baudelaire could allow this dramatic, tilted, tensed, and angular face to float into the same affective space as the dejected, inward-turning, and slumped figure from the Constantinople. In 1824, however, an ambitious young painter pursued the potential he saw in a contemporary canvas, but in terms of one already familiar register. Kallmyer took a lesson in pictorial drama from her expression, but the lesson was oriented to the efficacy of a cry depicted as checked instead of heard. This allowed Kallmyer to turn Delacroix's variation on the fatiguing theme to account, but in a way that allied his painting directly to the raft. Many figures converge on a hopeful horizon in the raft. Kallmyer made a closed mouth the focus of two tensed figures. They weren't trapped in a moment of endless crisis, they were frozen into stifled silence. To be sure, other depictions of the massacre of the innocents hone in on a mother-child duo. But Kallmyer's remarkable concentration on a motif of maternal fingers directly overlaying and thereby stifling infant lips is unparalleled. In effect, Kallmyer's salon entry has a single figure focus, and this in a narrative defined by population. The sheer ungainliness of scale seen in his painting has to be accounted by something of this order. A virtually colourless scene is inserted into the composition it also commands, essentially a large box of chiaroscuro. This leaves the dramatically dumbstruck figures of mother and child in a kind of pictorial quarantine, squeezing out the strips of outdoor brightness seen to the canvas's left and top. Kallmyer's decision indicates the extent to which the raft's composition provided artists painting in the years following its first exhibition with an inescapable and burdensome template for multi-figure painting. Of course, when he described the same figure to which Kallmyer had been drawn, Baudelaire did not mention the raft. He couldn't recognize Delacroix's premeditated invocation of any artist, Géricault included. In addition, however, the sense of anguish to which Baudelaire was drawn in the Constantinople and the Chios depends upon a strung-out, protracted sense of duration. These are temporal conditions far removed from the pleading action portrayed in the raft, where an unparalleled degree of exertion lends the depicted moment its tension. The straining figures in the raft's middle ground, their faces upturned in remarkable unison, lend perpetual, intertwined support for the composition's heroic apex. This fact allows us to draw a conclusion that bears on my identification of a particular interpretive tradition which has grown up around Delacroix's painting. Not one part of the raft was excerpted in the ways that I argue different canvases by Delacroix constantly offered themselves to a wide range of viewers. Delacroix's conception of multi-figure painting, unmotivated by the strength of unified purpose that courses through the many individuals depicted in the raft, included the recognition that markers of instantaneity were not viable, because not persuasive, outside of a particular depicted moment. And the raft's evocation of sound is one of these markers. Nothing could be more credible than the attribution of desperate shouts to the tilted faces seen in the raft's middle ground. Some of them are portrayed with slightly parted lips, a feature that Delacroix completely eliminated from a series of portrayals, all otherwise resolutely similar to each other. In the following examples, every single face is alerted, angular, and upturned. I refer to the clean-shaven disciple seen in the lower right-hand foreground of the Madonna of the Sacred Heart of 1820, the girl's head that dominates Young Orphan in a Cemetery of 1824, and finally, the face Delacroix portrayed in Portrait of an Old Woman, also of 1824. Delacroix achieved the emphatic line marking the old woman's mouth in the kiosk via a depicted expression that he gradually sharpened by means of a series of similar faces. But how was such a transformation credibly effected? Such angularity emerged because it is the evocation of age that comes to differentiate the various upturned faces. And this transformation from the young faces in the Madonna of the Sacred Heart and Orphan in a Cemetery to gaunter expressions seen in Portrait of an Old Woman and then in the kiosk indicates, I believe, the distance Delacroix attempted to open on a pose whose signature appearance was in the raft. Having found its expressivity impossible to relinquish, Delacroix was compelled instead to shed its proprietary instantaneity. His eventual decision to portray an older face caught in this pose's signature tilt must be seen, I suggest, in light of this attempt. The old woman Kallmyer applauded has a taut forehead and cheeks, and her lips appear closed. These features betray evidence of constriction. It is because the old woman's face appears so drawn and thin-lipped, fleshless, according to Alphonse Wabe, that her mouth appears closed in the virtually straight line to which Kallmyer was drawn. And Kallmyer proved that he would willingly shift the entirety of one of Delacroix's paintings aside in favor of the compelling interest of a particular element. And with that, he ensured his response would join a later tradition of interpretation. In his own painting, however, Kallmyer abandoned the resolute secondariness of figural focus that he had found compelling in Delacroix. The question this raises is whether the unexpected recalibration of interest glimpsed by Kallmyer, given that he was looking at one early, albeit major canvas, eventually came to constitute in Delacroix's painting a sufficiency in and of itself. Depicted suffering that welled up with surprising strength in lesser figures. Wasn't that the reason that why Baudelaire selected two figures from Delacroix's painting in his Salon of 1846? In that year, Baudelaire was writing from a longer view. Delacroix's career was by then almost 3 decades long. But a dishevelled chronology of that career came easily to Baudelaire, as it would later to Signac and Greenberg. And neither did it occur to Baudelaire in a pattern that I claim would become familiar. Neither did it occur to Baudelaire in a pattern that I claim would become familiar to represent that career by key works or divide it up according to distinct phases. These obstructions and others besides at least partly resolve themselves once the following, apparently minor, question is addressed. Given that the age of the woman depicted on the kiosk is suggested by a tautness of skin and a linearity of feature upon which Kallmyer dwelt, why did Baudelaire describe her in the way he did? His phrase, remember, was that the old woman appears so wrinkled and forlorn. The reason Baudelaire didn't describe the same features noted by Kallmyer was because articulation by age couldn't be accommodated by the loosened handling Delacroix had adopted as his routine approach to women's faces by the time he painted the Constantinople. It is this exact kind of handling and the matter of finish so eloquently discussed in Ike's catalogue essay that brings us together this weekend. Here, for example, we see the face of the bowed-over, grief-stricken virgin from Delacroix' 1847 to 1849 version of the entombment that can be seen in the exhibition. Even though Delacroix' Chios has become one of his best-known canvases, it doesn't include areas of paint that became representative of Delacroix' painting, at least for Baudelaire. In fact, critics in 1824 saw a particular kind of application that may have reached its peak in that very year. Paint sharply applied, perfectly tailored to a tensed and fleshless face in the foreground. This inserted portraiture, as it were, specifically pursued within a history painting, had receded from familiarity in 1846 because Delacroix had abandoned the particularization of skin and musculature upon which it depended. And by the way, it's fascinating to see, thanks to this exhibition, how copies of the old woman's face, as painted by Delacroix' students, seem to noticeably exaggerate her state of tension and alertness. This is Louis de Planay's copy. Both of the old woman's eyes shine much more assertively, rendering her expression that much more dramatic. As for Pierre Andrieux, whom you now see, yikes, his copy, much freer than Planay's, gives us a face which seems unambiguously terrorized. To return to my argument then, Baudelaire's backwards chronology shows Delacroix' abandonment of sharply applied paint. The figure more characteristic of Delacroix' later paint handling was the one Baudelaire mentioned first. And examples are legion of the sort of softened oval, olive-shaped eyes, slightly blurred features, to which Delacroix increasingly assimilated renditions of women's faces. The three seated, frontally posed female figures seen in the Algiers share a version of this oval. Such a face also appears set at a horizontal angle in the somnolent, closed-eye expression of the collapsed female figure depicted lying across the lap of the kneeling figure from the Constantinople. The facial features of the latter can hardly be discerned. They melt into shadows cast by the sweep of hair that falls in front of her face. And it's interesting that in the oil sketch visible on the right, which a beautiful oil sketch that I talked about earlier and which we can also see in the exhibition, Delacroix seems satisfied by an entirely featureless oval. If this was a preference on Baudelaire's part, however, that is, figures blurred or melting, utterly lacking in detail, then we need to explain why Baudelaire immediately reached for an identifier provided by skin to single out a face from the Chios, an old woman who appears, quote, so wrinkled, unquote. Baudelaire made recourse to descriptive traits based on an assumption of skin's faithfulness to character, and this assumption, I suggest, was informed by his reading of Stendhal. When the early date of his second choice of figure put him at a disadvantage, Baudelaire chose alternative indicators of age. As for Stendhal, forms of imprint and trace, most saliently those carried by the skin, satisfied his concern to see as perfect a fit as he deemed possible between cause and effect. In chapter 5 of my book, I analyse Stendhal's interest in such forms of evidence. For now, I note that these concerns permeate those episodes from Stendhal's History of Painting in Italy from 1917, quoted by Baudelaire in the Salon of 1846, and in one of his salon's most important sections called The Ideal and the Model. When Baudelaire marveled in this section at the intricacy and connectivity of individual causality, quote, such a hand demands such a foot, unquote, his awareness was exactly Stendhalian. In the same part of the history with which Baudelaire was especially familiar, Stendhal praised the, quote, fresh complexion of a young man from the provinces, in the best of health, who had recently arrived in Paris, unquote. His hale appearance cheered Stendhal. It confirmed his character, or rather the character Stendhal attributed to him, devoid of the guile in which Parisians were steeped. Stendhal was a fellow provincial. But the face of the woman Baudelaire described in the Constantinople is not only shadowed and softly painted, it is bowed down, turned in, shielded, variously masked. Delacroix's preference for evoking female figures with features blurred into generalized form involves an inexorable obliteration of the individualized face. The notion that a dress within a multi-figure painting and multi-figure compositions remained a constant within Delacroix's oeuvre is carried preeminently by the individualized face seemed to hold decreasing interest for Delacroix. And this ebbing of sharply defined faces from the canvases he painted from the 1840s to the 1860s is also to the fore of our attention this weekend. This accounts for the ease with which a tradition of viewers have been able to light upon dispersed subsidiary elements within Delacroix's paintings, including the selection by Signac and later Greenberg of peripheral passages of paint. There is, for example, Signac's attention to just one corner of the Algiers in which a cushion is depicted, and Greenberg's eccentric selection of a dog portrayed in the foreground of the Diana and Actaeon. At this point, then, I would conclude that close looking reveals that the paintings of an artist associated with tempestuous subjects are characterized by an increasing reluctance to paint individuated features, a reluctance so strongly marked that it must have stemmed from the potential of generalizing melted forms to convey a strong subsidence of drama and action. The degree to which Baudelaire responded to such a subsidence, even attributing, as he did, a crushed expression to a face patently alert and upturned, indicates that such quelled qualities satisfied his demand that blameless originality constitute the very character of Delacroix's painting. I will end this talk with one more piece of evidence for this claim, one that dates to the year in which the kiosk was exhibited. It comes from a dismissal of Corneille's Massacre of the Innocents due to its reliance on the art of the past. For one viewer at the Paris Salon of 1824, what seemed like an overt debt overpowered any possibility of praise. The judgment was Stendhal's. He said that Corneille couldn't prevent his revamped figure from looking like, quote, a pastiche of the Carracci, or, if you like, the portrait of a first-class actress impersonating a mother in despair, unquote. Stendhal's recognition of precedent in what he deemed a pale shadow of the Bolognese lineage entwined in the traditions Corneille had tried to emulate was what prompted Stendhal's exasperation with this contemporary version of the Massacre of the Innocents. His criticism cut to the quick of Corneille's attempt to evict an active, spotlit, wailing mother, an emblematic inheritance from the, quote, great period, unquote, by a silenced, staring, and more successfully dramatic one, a central figure draped in chiaroscuro so emphatic that Géricault himself, quote, might have liked it, unquote. And by lambasting Kallmyer's mother as one doomed to despair, Kallmyer revealed how he hadn't even reached as far as the hope Kallmyer actively inscribed in this figure. Her clasping fingers show how she clings to the promise invisibility gives her. Unfortunately for Stendhal, and even more unfortunately for the ambitious Kallmyer, the citational role that precedent played in a 19th century massacre of the innocents was brought to light in the first place by an attempt to paint a canvas wholly dependent on one dramatic moment. A painting such as the Kiosk, with its apparently disorganized depiction of time, is not necessarily an aberration in the tradition of the dramatic moment. Stendhal was not able to even consider an analysis of the Kiosk. His own strict template, enjoining sequentially organized moments, would have prevented him, I believe, from recognizing anything clear or unified in the Kiosk. And it's true that the Kiosk does not work within the boundaries of the tradition of the dramatic moment. It does not follow Géricault's raft in this respect. The Kiosk represents an effort to furnish new models in a tradition that had become increasingly problematic. By 1824, major painting in France, which still largely referred to the prestigious genre of historical paintings painted on a grand scale with many figures, had become acutely problematic and nearly disabled. With the Raft still its most outstanding recent representative, multi-figure painting appeared debilitated, its grounds for progression straitened. In the book, I suggest a new way to understand the work of Delacroix. My context is an examination of the critical field of the 1824 Salon, which shaped, I believe, the kinds of work Delacroix did in the later 1820s and beyond. My interpretative aim is to remain responsible to the challenging longevity of Delacroix's career while accounting for the inner rationale of his development. It's a complex subject, which I have only been able to conjure here with the example of Baudelaire and his surprising, but I think deeply symptomatic way of reading. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret, for an extremely stimulating paper. I should probably begin by saying there's nothing like the younger generation to make us feel old. And in fact, implicitly, I'm kind of picking up on Mark's theme about, is it possible to just tone down that light? You know, it just blinds me a little bit. Thank you. So essentially, I'm a product of the 80s, just like Darcy, and of different kinds of approaches, but nevertheless, I think, possessed with enough experience to appreciate your contribution. I was also happily assailed, or beset, if you want, by memories of Abby Warburg's memory project. And definitely by Bloom's The Anxiety of Influence, which seems to be catching disease, actually. It's moving from the artist now to the critic, right? With this in mind, we have a framework, and I think you're bringing up Michael Fried and Foster in this kind of progeny, or sequence, if you want, of other figures, precedents. In some ways, in a way, strengthens your topic when it comes to pictorial lineage. It was fascinating to see you focus on Baudelaire, and never thought that Baudelaire had such loyalties to the point of, in fact, obfuscating the obvious in order to support his hero, right?
Yeah.
But he obviously does. And in many ways also that leads me to wonder, what was Baudelaire's concept of originality, which was such a big issue, as you know, in the romantic context, the original without original or something like that. So is there any issue of that kind?
I think, he had to, as you divined in the paper, he had to construct this, justificatory, convoluted series of conditions in which he could enjoy originality. But there were so many, a bit like all of the planks that Darcy describes so eloquently in The Liberty, there were so many planks kind of shoring that up and kind of carved out of spaces and so on and so forth that, but once he was in there, he could kind of enjoy himself, but he was just kind of like, there was a tremendous amount of hand-wringing on Baudelaire's part before he got into this kind of temple. And then there's also the notion that he was never really in front of the painting at any point. It was always about recollected in memory and this kind of like dizzying space almost, that precluded any encounter. So originality and those sort of anything direct, like originality, that spark, that kind of, kindling, Baudelaire just couldn't like accept it. He couldn't accept. He just had to have all this edifice working all the time. That's more a kind of, that's not drawing in any quotations, and I apologize, but that's my sense.
I am. Yeah, and so the next question that brings to mind is also, how did Delacroix react to this kind of Baudelairean view of his work? Do we have any idea? I mean, Delacroix himself proclaimed his sources.
Absolutely, as you talked about
not only visually but also textually speaking, just a little bit like Corneille did with his unfortunate massacre of innocents. So, do we have any idea how would Delacroix react to this, to Baudelaire's extreme loyalty, let's say?
Well, there's the art historical moment I can think of is in Image of the People. T.J. Clarke talks about how bemused Delacroix is by the young Baudelaire rolling up into a studio all the time and kind of enthusing, So as Mark talks about in his catalogue essay, there's always this superiority that Delacroix kind of doles out to everybody, and he's always in the position of, everyone else is sort of in the position of dependency. So I don't think he ever was able to really, have any kind of equitable relationship to Baudelaire. I think he was bemused by it.
Right. I don't want to monopolize the podium. Questions from an audience made invisible by this light.
Yeah, it absolutely.
Welcome. I don't know if their hands already up.
Oh right, yeah. It's absolutely.
Yeah, Darcy.
Yeah, I should move too, actually.
Darcy, do you have a question or a comment or?
Well, Margaret, it was a very dense paper, and I feel like I certainly need to read it. In terms of, I'm really fascinated by your, what seems like a kind of quintessentially Delacroix problem, which is how to deal with how the range of his oeuvre is understood by contemporaries and people later, including ourselves. And if you could clarify for me one more time, if you don't mind, the succession of works that Baudelaire spoke to, that you had that wonderful strip, which, by the way, was so fascinating. Liberty was not on it.
Yes.
Could you just restate what your point was about how that strip was being understood?
Yeah,
sequence.
that's fantastic, and it just, when I remember reading that for the first time, I was just amazed by the roll call and kind of all higgledy-piggledy. So that got me thinking about this unevenness of attention.
Right.
And I guess that's really my main, that I can't, I can't but not see that in almost every response to Delacroix, and Baudelaire is like the great exponent of that. So it's that like unevenness, and it's an ability to remain content with that unevenness, and even though he calls it a succession of works, and as you say, you know, there's just some huge, the big lacuna is the liberty, but it doesn't function as a succession, because he couldn't bring, you know, he couldn't bring a succession into focus at any moment. He couldn't hold it in his mind. You know, everything was so sequential and deferred. I would say, you know, everything's deferred, and when he can't access the painting, you know, like that's what really fascinated me about that description from when you look at the painting. As of course you know this painting so well. There isn't one crow's foot in that entire woman's face, and it's described as wrinkled. Right. So I seem to be getting away from your excellent question just because it's so great, but it's unevenness, it's the kind of disheveledment of chronology that has just become established in references to the overall span of the career. Is that helpful?
That helps. That definitely helps. I really look forward to reading your book.
Oh gosh, well, you know, thanks be to God, somebody's finally going to publish it, Janie Mac. I mean,
And actually, Margaret gave me a wonderful postcard yesterday that has the cover of her book already. So the book is definitely out, right? And everyone should know about it. And too bad we don't have copies to sign right today.
Oh gosh, well, you know, Nina's been so, you know, you know, this is like Delacroix is unfortunately very hard to.
Yeah. So
you know,
the more we have, the better it is.
Yeah.
Definitely.
If I had your French, Nina, you know, and I was in France, I would.
I also wanted to ask for more questions, while at the same time, if I may,
please
plug in some questions myself. I like the structure that you have implicitly suggested in your argument between Kallmyer, for example, on the one hand, and Baudelaire. Baudelaire kind of, you know, willfully myopic view of origins or precedent in Delacroix versus Kallmyer's immediate recognition, right, of it, and even down to the faux pas of identify who did it, who was there before. Like, you know, this is Géricault, and before Géricault there was Guido Reni, and there was Poussin, and you name it, right? So this, I think, to me, was the most, how to say, convincing argument that you bring up, and all the rest builds around it.
Okay.
I had a concern, and I wanted to explain, because maybe just like Darcy, I have to reread that, and it's so much easier to absorb in writing. Regarding what you call the moment, the kind of concentrated moment of drama, right, versus the dispersed one. And I will agree with you that the Massacres of Chios, given, you know, what we know from critical reviews of the time, was identified as a dispersed composition, whereas Géricault's, obviously, even compositionally, is climactic. You know, it's unified. So, do I understand that Baudelaire's ability to excerpt a figure from the Delacroix, and Kallmyer's ability also to excerpt a figure from the Delacroix, is due to the fact that it was dispersed, as opposed to Géricault, who created a kind of unified composition and therefore made this less possible?
Absolutely. I'm obviously, I need to really, you know, make that.
No, it's very clear. I wasn't quite sure.
No, you've said that absolutely beautifully, and you've summed up exactly what I was trying to say. So, thank you very much indeed. That's exactly it. Like, there's just an ability to just kind of, you know, just take things,
right,
you know,
right,
whether in
right,
memory
right.
or in the moment.
It makes total sense. And then the issue, I thought, you know, in terms of the innovative dimension in your paper, was that issue of sound. Yeah. Believe it or not, I'd never really thought of sound as emitted from figures in pain when I see them. And, I'm totally kind of
okay.
focused on the physical marks of it. In other words, the visual physical marks as opposed to the acoustic marks. And I should, because here we had Paganini, right? But I just wanted to say that this was interesting. Géricault as relating to the voice of pain, and then Cognier actually shutting that voice, right, in the boy's mouth, which no one would even pay attention to, but yes, and it's actually becoming, as you showed it in the picture there, not only a Kallmyer, as I think Bloom would call it, change the model, but also it becomes a necessity of the action, because if the kid screamed, they would be discovered, right? They were hiding behind the mother and child trying to avoid the massacre, right? So it's also, kind of called for by the action. And nevertheless, the painting didn't find grace in Stendhal's eye, because it was a collage, if you want, or a kind of pastiche of interesting. Did Baudelaire write anything about that painting?
I don't think so. I don't think so. It's terribly disappointing. I mean, actually, ironically, as you know, that wonderful collection of Stendhal's art criticism has the Cognier insert on the the lips displacing, the fingers displacing the lips. And yet, Stendhal missed that picture, which would have been,
interesting. Well, I mean, he had a parti pris, right? And so he saw what he wanted to see and missed what he wanted to miss, I assume.
Absolutely. And as you say, this is great. I feel like you've done such a great job of really drawing out my paper. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't have the PowerPoint, but it helped a lot to see the images. More questions from the audience, I guess. Yes.
Thank you. This was very stimulating.
Thank you.
I was especially struck by your description of how, at some moment for Delacroix, marks of instantaneity become inviolable. Like instantaneousness is not viable anymore. And then the old women in Chios is an example of that. And I wanted you to say a little bit more about what happens later on when we think about Sardanapalus. It seems like markers of instantaneity are proliferating, right, in the death of Sardanapalus.
Okay, do you mean in specific scenes?
Exactly. There are so many moments of instantaneity that are dramatic moments, let's say, that are vying for our attention, and all of them are, attracting us, drawing us, all these mini tragic vignettes almost in Sardanapalus that are drawing us. So what happens to Delacroix? What happens to that, problematic of the instantaneity?
That's a terrific way of, I'm sort of scrolling back through the Rolodex in my head now because of how great that question is to come up with a sufficiently good answer to what you've just said. And so I guess for me, the recessed figure at the center of the Sardanapalus has proved my sort of, I suppose, my Achilles heel, because I tend to map that with the central male in the chaos. So what you're encouraging me to do is, go back into that painting in a much a more exploratory way and sort of think about those markers. I'm presuming I have talked about the plunging sword, and maybe I feel it's mapped onto the profusion of tassels that issues instead of the blood. So there's kind of displacement throughout that strange elephant head, somnolent.
Or the black figure in the left next to the woman who's covering her head.
Oh my goodness.
About to kill himself. His eyes are bloodshot.
Yes, absolutely. Gosh, I'm such a chaos junkie that I really have to learn more, to do a better job.
This is a great term.
Yes, that's the technical term that we use. Actually, I think I'm going to just try and draw this to a conclusion, only because I think people are probably a bit tired, and I know that our speakers need to be wined and dined, or at least dined. So we will reconvene, what does it say here, at 1 o'clock. So if you can try and make your way back to your seat a little bit before then, that would be great. And thank you so much for your attention.
And I thank you so much, Ike, to invite me here. And I am going to speak slowly to be understood, because my English is not very good, as you can see, evidently. I begin the section about Delacroix's followers, Delacroix's pupils, with Lasalle-Bordes. He is the author of the Coupole du Luxembourg, as he said himself. And in my topic is Delacroix and Lasalle-Bordes, about the problem of attribution of this cupola. So I am very happy to be here, because I'd like to speak to you about a totally unknown Romantic painter. History presents a different way to analyze the problem of artwork attribution. My example is structured around the relationship between Eugène Delacroix, the great Romantic painter, and Gustave Lasalle-Bordes, an unknown Romantic painter. Nobody knows about Lasalle-Bordes except scholars. Who was he? He was one of the so-called pupils of Delacroix. In his 2013 Delacroix's Pedagogical Desire essay, Margaret MacNamidhe wrote that Gustave Lasalle-Bordes, quote, developed a lasting grudge against his former master, unquote, Delacroix himself, and was sure to be downplayed and blocked by him. I'd like to insist a little more on the detail of this quarrel, referring to an unpublished manuscript of Lasalle-Bordes. I found out about it in 1996 in the Library of Arts and Archaeology in Paris. Now, this manuscript is kept by the INHA, the National Institute of Art History in Paris. This manuscript was kept secret. It has never been quoted, despite its casting a new light on the relationship between a 19th century master and his apprentice. Our object of interest is that letter, a very long one, 50 pages long. 50 pages, yes. 50 pages. Really 50 pages. He had something to write, to say. It's written by the painter Lasalle-Bordes to Philippe Berti in English, a critic and art historian who wanted to prepare an edition of Delacroix's letters. Here's Philippe Berti. The date of this letter is September 16, 1880, and it is an authentic manuscript by Lasalle-Bordes. His subject is Delacroix and the lasting grudge, on which I'd like to shed a new light, and which I think should eventually be better described as a justified anger, perhaps. It all began with Philippe Berti preparing his edition of Delacroix's letters. It is the first edition of the letters, and there is a second one. So he is preparing the second one. We are in 1879. Delacroix died 16 years ago. Critics are then working hard to present Delacroix as a first French painter unjustly disregarded. And to do so, they frequently use the Romantic cliché of artiste maudit. The least that could be said is that they are not working in haste. It took them 16 years to work. But a small team is trying to complete a few books about the painter. They are working with all the documents they have at hand. letters, diaries, papers, testimonies, biographic details, but also legends. For example, the legend, the 3 times Delacroix has miraculously escaped from certain deaths in his childhood. It's a legend about Delacroix and is repeated in all the books. In this context of ideological promotion of a French painter, Philippe Berti is writing to the pupils of Delacroix. Lasalle-Bordes is one of them. He sends to Philippe Berti this terrible letter accusing Delacroix of neglecting to play his part in an implicit contract of nepotism. We have a very well-known hand manuscript of Michel Tourneux, made out of his letter. Michel Tourneux, the second art historian and critic, was a friend of Philippe Berti. Both of them are in the team I was just speaking about. Michel Tourneux transcribes some selected parts of Lasalle-Bordes' endless letter that Philippe Berti has lent him. They are in this book, the book of Maurice Tourneux. Tourneux, as Berti, was especially interested in Delacroix. In 1885, he published this essay entitled Delacroix devant ses contemporains, Delacroix facing his contemporaries, a biographical and hagiographical account that also gathers selected documents. A few years later, he wrote a critical biography of Delacroix. To write the first book, he partially copied some Lasalle-Bordes letter. His manuscript is kept in the Cabinet des Estampes of France National Library. It was considered to be the unique transcription of Lasalle-Bordes' testimony on Delacroix until I found out the original version of it. The transcription of Maurice Tourneux is a one-sided copy. Tourneux used it as an account of the master's painting secret. That is, for example, works recipes, special brush skills, specific way of using colors, etc., etc. The document belongs to the tradition of the workshop secret books through which a master recipes would circulate. Tourneux wants to keep up this tradition to prove that Delacroix was just like an old master from the Renaissance times. We can understand the weight of this tradition if we consider the 2001 book by English painter David Hockney, Secret Knowledge, Rediscovering the Lost Techniques of the Old Masters. Alors, the title is ironical because the secret knowledge and the lost techniques unveiled in the book are in fact the general use of photographical devices that has been elaborated before the invention of photography itself, and that allowed to reproduce something without having to meticulously draw it. It's a tremendous revelation. All the admirable old masters worshipped for the genius of their drawing techniques were in fact calking and transferring images through the use of optical devices. Those were the old masters' recipes and painting secrets. Hockney is actually referring to his book. For example, the famous chandelier in Van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, here is a chandelier, was drawn through a light projection as evidenced by Hockney, who compared perspective distortion through an optical devices and natural perspective when the naked eye is the only optical instrument. Another ironical vision of those secrets, painting secrets, is rendered by Paul McCarthy in his performance, Painter, from 1995. This is a video. The video of the performance shows the painter in his studio. He's preparing mixtures like a clumsy alchemist. We can see here the tool of his art, dramatically oversized. And here he's preparing the... he's preparing this an ordinary painting box. It's not artist color here. So the painter is ironically sacralized when comes the short moment of romantic inspiration as the painter, after a long meditation, throw a spray of color in canvas, and it's finished. The picture is finished. In fact, our time, we can see in that example, are not very impressed by the myth of romantic genius. Now we are interested in archives and context of art production. So let's go back to the 19th century and Delacroix and Tourneux. We can see how Tourneux cuts and softens Lasalle-Bordes' letter, only referring to details that can be useful for the kind of positive knowledge he wants to unveil on Delacroix as a master. The various and evolving meanings of the word master itself must be considered. During Delacroix's century, the word acquired a positive meaning while continuing to simply refer to the boss of an art studio, the person who was in charge of organization, clients, and commissions, an economical model described by Svetlana Alpers in Rembrandt's enterprise, The Studio and the Market. Rembrandt is one of the rare masters who would consider himself like the boss of a business. But every master did it the very same way every master used optical devices to render perspective. Tourneux wouldn't risk distorting Delacroix's reputation as a master. To avoid such risk, he omits important details. He is what Donna Haraway described as a modest witness. That is, he produced an effect of authority, and while pretending to remain decent, he actually hides some parts of the document, transforming it into a pacific testimony. Tourneux appears to be a perfectly objective and polite information provider. Even so, he falsified a document. We have to be careful with such a testimony. His function was to corroborate the figure of an idealized character, the 19th century artist, as the heir of the old master's tradition in the art. The reader of Maurice Tourneux's book has no other choice but to believe that this handmade copy of the letters is the only existing one, and that the original has been lost. Maurice Tourneux's copy being so well known, it was impossible to imagine the existence of another manuscript kept in another Parisian library. Robert N. Beaton, who worked on Lasalle-Bordes in 1967, didn't know about it. He, like every other historian, quotes Maurice Tourneux's manuscripts. As a consequence, the full manuscript had not been copied yet, and the real manuscript was hidden for years. So, what is Lasalle-Bordes' claim in the unedited version of this manuscript? Let's consider some detail now. Lasalle-Bordes writes, alors I quote in French and then I translate, « Bien des personnes savaient, sans que je m'en fusse vanté, qu'à part la composition, tout le travail de la bibliothèque du Luxembourg était mon œuvre. » Many people knew, everybody understood, without my boasting about it, that except for composition, it is the important thing, all the work in the Luxembourg library was mine. He reveals, or at least he's sharing his convictions, that a lot of people knew he had painted the scenes of the Luxembourg Palace Library himself, where the French Senate is today. Their work are attributed to Delacroix. I would like to focus on the expression à part la composition, except for the composition, and interpret it in the context of those times. It's a problem of artwork attribution. By composition, Lasalle-Bordes, just like Delacroix on his contemporaries, meant the dessin, that is both the drawing itself. Where is it? It's another view of the cupola. The drawing itself and the general conception. It is an anonymous word in French. Dessin, spelled A-I-N, and drawing as drawing, and dessin, spelled E-I-N, as artistic intention or conception. Being responsible for the sketch of an artwork meant being the artist who made the final piece and would be acknowledged for it. But Lasalle-Bordes made all the painted work of the decorative scenes in the library, including the Coupole du Luxembourg. This means the curved ceiling of the library. It's not the Tournon dome, the dome de Tournon of the Luxembourg Palace is at the interior. What is important, according to him, is the effect produced on the viewer by the painting itself, and not at all the main idea, the idée première, concerning the choice of the literary project, for example, like here, characters from mythology and literature. Lasalle-Bordes admitted that Delacroix chose the mise en scène, the pattern of the painting decorative program. Nonetheless, in Lasalle-Bordes' view, it's rather unfair that Delacroix would take all the credit for a work he didn't even paint himself, and for which Lasalle-Bordes would remain totally acknowledged. Something had changed since the Renaissance and the old masters area. Then the design of the artwork prevailed over his actual making. The issue is generally obliterated. For example, when visiting a museum nowadays, the guide never emphasizes that most painting result from teamwork. The master, I've just explained, could be assimilated to a boss who is commands taking and the commission, negotiating fees, leading the work direction, and choosing the spirit of the work that we call style. Art history is filled with such attribution issues. The best known is Tintoretto's, who still broke down after the death of his daughter, Maria Robusta, called Tintoretta. It's a guerrilla girl's feminist bedside companion, comic strip. So this Tintoretta has been the main hand behind Tintoretto's artwork. Donc, to illustrate, there is an extract of the Guerrilla Girl's Bedside Companion about Western art. Some art historians said that the master was so afflicted by his daughter's death that he lost all his own talent, but in reality, he lost a very good adjunct artist, if I dare say. This story proves that the execution of the painting shouldn't be so neglected. Lasalle-Bordes' argument should be listened to because the frame of mind has changed since then. During the Renaissance, everybody knew that Tintoretta was the right-hand woman behind her father's painting, but she was not considered for that. And she was conditioned to find it absolutely normal. She was very appreciated for her skills. We have a lot of testimonies about it, but the work was attributed to her father, no matter what. Even if she had not painted it himself, it was not a problem. It is the same thing nowadays when, for example, in architecture, a building is attributed to the architect, even if most of the work is done, in fact, by his team of architects and team of engineers too. Nobody finds it abnormal. It's perfectly usual as such. It's the same with the participation of children, pupils, women in art. Now people are most interested in the place of women, for instance, in the studio within the teamwork. Time are changing. For example, now people think that it is abusive when a master, as a full professor in a university, uses the research work of his students to write his own book. But it was considered very correct 20 years ago, or perhaps no, 50 years ago. But now, the rejection of the master in art is the same as the rejection of the master at the university. People reject both patriarchy and nepotism. The tradition of attributing every work to a male name is weighing down because of the extinction of patriarchal patterns which have been ruling everything in the past, as everybody knows. Delacroix belongs to this scheme. For him, it's not a problem at all if somebody else makes his painting. It was the case for every other old master. But looking closely at the issue at stake with Delacroix and Lasalle-Bordes, it must be noted that Delacroix breached the contract traditionally linking an old master to his studio and pupils, the contract of nepotism itself. In this time, you had to first be a pupil, and then, if a male, you could eventually become a master. The reason why Lasalle-Bordes is holding the grudge against Delacroix clearly is not about the nepotism contract itself. He accepted it. It is another problem. He is enraged because the master did not help the student to become a proper master, to reach a better position in life, that is, to have his own commissions. Worse, Delacroix used his political influence to exclude his student from potential commission while he needed him to finish his own paintings. In the letter, Lasalle-Bordes recalls very precisely the political context of what we consider retrospectively like a travesty. Its protagonist fooled the Minister of the Art and Haussmann, the prefect of the department. Here are Haussmannian buildings. Haussmann was reconfiguring all Paris city. Both wanted to commission Lasalle-Bordes, but Delacroix was also a member of the Paris Council, and he knew the two men very well. He made sure Lasalle-Bordes wouldn't get these commissions so as to keep him for himself, so to speak. I was sacrificed, write Lasalle-Bordes. I first read the extract in French and then in English. Quote, apprenant de moi que Fould, alors ministre d'État et des Beaux-Arts, allait me donner un grand travail au Conseil d'État et que M. Haussmann, préfet de la Seine, allait en même temps me donner à décorer tout le sanctuaire de l'église de Belleville nouvellement construite, il fut trouver ces messieurs et les supplia de ne pas me donner ce travail parce qu'il avait besoin de moi, qu'il ne pouvait pas me remplacer et que ces travaux allaient être arrêtés. After I told Delacroix that Fould, the State and Beaux-Arts Minister, would commission me for an important work at the Conseil d'État, and that Haussmann, the prefect of the Seine, would also ask me to paint the whole sanctuary of the recently built Belleville Church, he went to see these men and begged them not to give me those jobs because he needed me, because he couldn't replace me, and because his own work would have been stopped because of these. Il était lié avec Fould. Il était depuis plusieurs mois membre du conseil municipal de Paris. Je fus sacrifié, malgré l'annonce que ces messieurs m'avaient faite de ces deux commandes qui, par leur importance, me permettraient, donc lire m'aurait permis, de montrer ce que j'avais acquis d'expérience dans la peinture ornementale. He was acquainted with Ford and has just been appointed a member of the City Council of Paris. I was sacrificed, despite the two of them having announced me these two commissions whose importance would have allowed me to display the experience I had in ornamental painting. This possessive attitude of Delacroix breaches the traditional contract of the old Renaissance master who is expected to promote his good student. For sure, it can be agreed upon that Lasalle-Bordes wasn't very careful when speaking about his project to Delacroix. He made a tragic mistake. But in fact, Delacroix, has he been a good Renaissance master, should have helped his student to take on his own project. Quite the contrary, he plotted to ruin this student's chance. The traditional contract of nepotism was over, breached by the master himself. Lasalle-Bordes spent several years painting the dome and the library. Delacroix was not able to place correctly on the dome the character he wanted to put there, according to Lasalle-Bordes' letter. His main idea was a pure abstraction, as he said. The important matter is now the effect of painting, the achievement of the artwork. The dome of the Luxembourg is Lasalle-Bordes' artwork and not Delacroix'. Lasalle-Bordes uses the argument of style, which belonged to the sole master in the ancient tradition. He goes on, saying that the painting is made is in own style. No slide. Ceux qui s'y connaissaient avaient remarqué qu'il régnait, surtout dans l'ensemble de la coupole, un autre tempérament que celui de Delacroix. Il y avait une limpidité de lumière calme qui n'a jamais été dans les ressources du talent de Delacroix. As he said, connoisseurs have noticed how the temperament, especially in the whole cupola, was different from Delacroix'. There was a limpidity of light and calm which Delacroix' resources couldn't achieve. Here, Lasalle-Bordes insists on his own style. He is no longer an underling obeying the master order. He himself and freely make stylistic choices. Delacroix tries to promise him a future reconnaissance as a great decorative painter if he keeps his mouth shut. Lasalle. No, it's not it. I have no slide. Lasalle, je vous ai de très grandes obligations, mais jamais personne ne me fera avouer la part que vous avez prise à mes travaux, et si jamais vous vous en vantez, ce sera entre nous une lutte à mort. Ce sera la lutte du pot de fer contre le pot de terre. Vous sauterez. Tout finit par se savoir un jour, attendez. Lasalle, I'm most obligated to you, but no one will ever force me to acknowledge the importance of your participation in my work. And should you go on boasting about it, it would be dreadly struggle between us. It will be the David against Goliath. But you will lose. The trust will be out. Be patient. The prediction has come true. Now we clearly know about the dome and the library of the Luxembourg. It's a drop of water in the ocean of attribution in the art, our main interest today. There is another detail I want to bring out. When Lasalle-Bordes wrote those letters, perhaps Delacroix was not as famous as he became later. And as we imagine him now it's very important, but in those times it was not so famous. It's important. It was possible in those times for Lasalle-Bordes to express his anger and resentment without bringing down a legend. We have to consider this gap when the art history glorified an artist afterward. In those years, Maurice Tourneux and Philippe Berti were working on the glorification of Delacroix, seeking the testimony of his pupils and gathering many documents about him. In this context, it was impossible for them to accept Lasalle-Bordes' claims. It would have ruined their hagiographic project. They knew very well that Delacroix was sick and crushed under a double commission, Palais du Luxembourg et Palais Bourbon, in the same time. Arlette Cerula's research shows that the painter slow worked because of his bad health and was accumulating delays in the two sites. But for the historian, such realities of light should be excluded. They have a legend to write. It is the more important. It is a good example of how figures of geniuses, representative of their time, have been built. Delacroix's glory lies in the traditional custom of having one main name and only one to represent and glorify an historic period, Romanticism, French Romanticism in this case. This intellectual habit occults the helpers, the group, the women, the children, the partner, the precise reality, and the archives testimonies in the creative process. Most specific inventions in a period of time are abusively attributed to one person, the genius. But in fact, some of those men are well known because they are first and foremost very skilled precisely at capturing l'air du temps, the zeitgeist. Critics, just like Maurice Tourneau and Philippe Berti, come afterward and build up a narrative that single out these individuals as geniuses. It's impossible nowadays to go on and keep such romantic conception so typical of the 19th century. Here is a challenge of a new art history which analyzes the social context of production and the dominant frames of mind of each area. Something had changed, in fact, in the manner of the kind of history of art we want to make. To open up my paper to more contemporary version of this issue, I would like to bring out two emblematic situations. On the one hand, the example is Mr. Picasso. Picasso making everything himself, as is continued today by Marlène Dumas in her studio, for instance, making her paintings herself. We can see her in her studio painting. On the other hand, there is a tradition in the wake of Warhol factory of having assistants in a studio. Here is the studio of, for example, the Japanese artist Murakami. Some artists, as Jeff Koons, Xavier Deillan, or Damien Hirst, consider perfectly normal to have assistants, as an old master would. They are pretending that there is no interruption of this continuity. Speaking about a specific artwork in a catalogue, Murakami recalls that it was the great talent of one of his assistants which produced the effect of an artwork. As it happens, it was a funny effect. The Hiropon factories, Murakami has several factories, is a trade corporation whose goal is to produce art as if it were any kind of product. Just like Japanese mangaka, assistants are poorly paid and work hard. We can see it. It is a job ad for an assistant. We can see the word, for example, overtimes, cleaning, storage cleaning here. Overtime, I don't remember where it is. Oui, possible here. Project based, possible overtime. It's slavery, organized slavery. Is the nepotism contract respected in this case? Every aspiring artist working as an assistant hopes to be acknowledged and designated as a proper artist at some point. Will they succeed? Perhaps. According to, for example, this paper, Some assistants are indeed becoming artists after working for the master Murakami, who designates himself quite openly as the enterprise's boss. To conclude, we have to consider the process as a whole. Delacroix might have breached a contract, but the responsibility of Lasalle-Bordes is not negligible. He wouldn't have been so confident in the whole system of nepotism. He was working like a log or like a dog at the Luxembourg Palace, remaining stuck in the root of a frame of mind he didn't think about. He was expecting his master to make him a master. So to finish, I'd like to quote Mr. Puntilla and his servant Mati by Bertolt Brecht. I read it in French a long time ago. Un bon maître, nous en aurons un dès que chacun sera le sien. A good master will all have once everyone is his own. As Delacroix himself when he was young. And here is le Djaour et le Pacha. Struggle of the Djaour and the Pacha. Delacroix was young. He had a passion for literature and poetry, with no concern for his posthumous fame. He was ambitious, of course, but he was not consumed by the desire of glory, the desire to become an old master at a time when this concept was vanishing and disappearing, actually. So I finished.
Hi, I'm Todd Olson. Thank you, Anne, for a lovely, lovely paper. And I really loved it. I think after Mark Gottlieb had talked about the silent tier of responding to our archival work of the 1980s, there's a lovely connection here. And part of that connection is, part of what Mark and Darcy have depended upon is the revolution in terms of the creation of archives and the creation of a bureaucracy to make things available. Now you're telling the other tier of research of the 1980s, 90s, which was when one had to rely on proprietary knowledge of letters and drawings, and the ways in which there's a part of the history of art of the 1980s, and the same is in terms of both Mark's and Darcy's work, is the ways in which the public, we've depended so much upon the public record as such. So what's interesting about your talk in that regard is, one, is it brings back those memories of trying to find the materials, and indeed you find them in the newly constituted Jacques Doucet collection in the Bibliothèque. And in that finding, you unveil this problem, which is the control of knowledge through the control of the letters. So one of the narratives that you tell is a wonderful narrative, and there was a cliffhanger, and we got to at the end, which was that the formation of Delacroix as a singular figure in 1881, when they were trying to formulate and create the monograph on him, and create the letters, is that the disgruntled student, his voice had to be expelled. And that's another interest what I loved about your talk, is it's a good wake-up call and reminder is to treat your students and call, when you're writing those letters of recommendation, after you're dead, you might be, oh, anyway. So in that regard, the talk was about this art historiography project, which was underlying throughout, which was very helpful for us, I think. The other project is, of course, this reading through the disgruntled, whether we call him student or not, that's something Mark Gottlieb will be addressing, is this moment, as Mark in his essay talks about, is the moment after David's studio, where the the terms of the relationship between the master and the pupil or the assistant are being redefined. And then the language that's provided, even at that moment when your artist is defining his relationship to, trying to claim that the master nepotism model is kind of being broken apart, and he's to be blamed. He's being screwed. I mean, ultimately, and that is because. But his claim is not only for his claim for the style, but also he keeps on using the words travaux, travail. He opposes composition with travail, which is really, I thought it was really interesting how even in his claims toward some kind of authority or legitimacy, he continues to think of himself as a craftsman, as a worker in the studio, and that's what he's okay. So that I think was an interesting point you're making in terms of the search for at least his self-definition is not that he's a genius. He never calls himself a genius as such, but a worker. So part of that, in trying to understand that, I think it would be interesting and it'd be useful to think about the decorative projects, especially in the context of this exhibition, which is about this, what do you do with sketches, and what do you do with that kind of that mobility between sketch and finished work or not finished work or whatever, these kinds of issues. And what you brought on the table is the importance of the sketch as the delegation of labor. That is, the sketch is a way to develop a relation to instruct an assistant, particularly for a large-scale work. So, in particular, the cupola in the Luxembourg Palace is one such work where we don't have that intimate scale of the sketch to the smaller works. And indeed, the painting in this exhibition, we have this lovely latex full-scale pictures, which are indeed telling us something about when Delacroix is moving up in terms of size of picture, he has to create some way of establishing a relationship with another painter for collaboration. And as Ike was talking to us in the exhibition, talking about the ways in which Delacroix was developing ways of having assistants establishing pictures and then moving in to that work. So that moving into the work after the initial impact is not the close proximity of a sketch to small image, but rather developing this relationship large image. Now, in the Luxembourg Palace at the time that Delacroix is working is a great example of that kind of delegation of authority, which is the Marie de Medici series by Rubens. So it might be interesting to think, we talk about Rubens and the sketch and the recitation of Rubens by Delacroix constantly, but in terms of his practical kind of experience, he's working off of the Marie de Medici series. There's an example in LA and you try to figure out why the hell is he? It's a cutout version of. It's like it's really hard to figure sometimes why he chooses what he does in terms of that relationship to Rubens. Okay, that's a question. That's my kind of question. But part of that. Let me just state what I think would be helpful thinking about in terms of the sketches and this delegation of authority and why Rubens. And this takes me back down memory lane to a seminar I had with Ike, where I met her in a Michael Baxendale seminar. And we talked about Roger de Pile and the relationship between Rubens' project and the Crozat Circle, the use of Rubens as a model for not large-scale paintings, but for small, intimate paintings, for the sketch. And in an interesting inversion in kind of the art historiography in terms of art history in France, right around into the 18th and the 19th century is the kind of inversion where Poussin, who's a small-scale painter, becomes the kind of model for the large machine, and Rubens becomes this model for intimate, small-scale pictures. So what you're describing, again, is this really interesting overlapping set of considerations where that laborer, or that factory worker, as it were, is negotiating with the master a new set of relations based on a shift from small-scale pictures to trying to imagine them in a large ornamental pattern. And that becomes kind of the bone of contention between the two of them, is how that gets laid out. And it's interesting in your analysis of the notion of when the word composition comes in, it might be interesting to inflect it not so much with design or diseño, but the whole concept of a tout ensemble, an overall composition, so that could be kind of an underlying strategy for thinking about Rubens. Is not so much where if indeed Delacroix is trying to negotiate small to large, he's also trying to think in terms of these Deleuzian categories of the unified composition. And that would fit in nicely with the sense of the limpidité, limpidity of light that described is, again, a worker that works with limpid light is a very special case of someone who's claiming work, but in terms of color. So I enjoyed it immensely. I'd like to open it up in terms of questions, perhaps, specific questions from the group, and I can help with that. If you would like to respond, that would be lovely, but...
I think it's very interesting in the exhibition, the contrast within the great composition and little one, for example, the little by Delacroix himself. That is not a sketch; it's a finished painting. A little Croisé at Constantinople is the same and is not the same as the great one, and is important in the Lasalle-Bordes testimony, à part la composition, except of the composition, because it is the real key. What you say? Key. It's the key for Delacroix. He made the composition, so he's the author. But a new thing is arriving, and people with with tools. Okay. They said it's mine. Composition doesn't. It's not important. The important is I had the tool and I made the thing. And what is important? So they have two opposite conception of the meaning of authority, of author. Who is the author? Author.
Authority,
yes,
yeah,
yes,
and
yes.
authorship, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anne. This was fascinating, and what a discovery in this age in which we do not discover anymore. We just simply reformulate a little bit. So I really appreciate that and the excitement that goes with this. I also wonder, how can we substantiate Lasalle-Bordes' claims, right? I mean, this is what he writes, but was it really true? In other words, are they drawings? Are there, kind of preparatory studies for parts of the cupola? Who did them step by step until they became those bigger, as Todd was saying, those bigger finished?
Yeah, because Delacroix was sick, very sick, and the throat. And we have a lot of testimonies, for example, about the heat. His studio was very hot, and it was impossible to him to be on a scale in a very.
He couldn't go up on the ladder.
It was impossible to paint a ceiling like that. I don't know if you have paint fresco, and we are frightened every time. So the contract was clear. It was impossible to him to do that, and so he doesn't. So he made the little écusson. Alors écusson.
Coat of arms.
Ouais,
Coat of arms.
yeah. About, for example, Orphée, and we have testimonies in his notes in the Michele Anouche translation. We have a lot of testimony about the realization of those, for example, Orpheus, because it was possible to have a canvas on an easel in a studio, but for the cupola it was impossible. It was in situ work, in fact.
So so was he alone? Was Lasalle-Bordes alone in executing the whole thing, or was there a crew assisting Lasalle-Bordes, or working just like him?
Because it was a problem of Delacroix. He had a few only few assistants. There are three. In fact, Andrieux, De Planay, and Lasalle-Bordes. And so Lasalle-Bordes was on one side, and in the same time, he had the other side in the Palais Bourbon, and it was a terrific ceiling with 9, 10 little cupolas and some, I don't know to say, other half cupolas, if you understand what I mean, and the other one were here.
So and typically in like 18th century application of painting, it could be just canvas applied with oil canvas on the wall. But these are special circumstances, right? Where because the curvature had to be directly painted. Is that correct?
Yeah, they tried several solutions. The first one was to have a canvas and to maroufler, to put on the canvas on the ceiling. It was a catastrophe. Everybody is ruining and falling down, and it was impossible. So the only solution was to paint directly, like a fresco, like Michelangelo painting frescoes. It was a hard work. It's a hard work to.
Just like a little, I'll be done in an instant, but just like a coda is, there was still no intermediary stages. In other words, big studies, études, ébauches, in oils. And who did those? Cartoons, yeah, exactly. Who was the author of those? Do we have those?
Yes, we have. Yes.
And they are by Delacroix or by Lasalle-Bordes?
No, Delacroix. Cartoons, à part la composition. We have the cartoons, the preparation, the sketches, for example.
They're by Delacroix.
By Delacroix. And it was his idea, Dante. It's a Dante composition, and Dante for him is very important. He's a very great reader of Dante, Divine Comedy. Dante. The Dante comedy. He was a reader, very important for him. So it is a Dante composition. We have Dante with all in the composition itself.
But the cupola, the center of the cupola is you wouldn't draw the clouds. I mean, it's a sense of what's being claimed here is that the perspectival, the atmosphere of the clouds is something that can't be drawn as such, but has to be application of paint, right? So again, the idea that the worker making claims for that, at least that area.
Yes, we have two parts in that composition. La frise, the people like that, and on the clouds, there are two different things. And the sketches of the figures is Delacroix, but the cupola with the clouds is Lasalle-Bordes, in fact.
I thank you very much, and I I wanted to ask you a little bit more about our unfortunate Lasalle-Bordes.
Poor Lasalle-Bordes.
And the charge is that Delacroix failed to honor his part of the nepotistic contract by essentially blocking Lasalle-Bordes' career at this point so that Lasalle-Bordes could remain useful to Delacroix. So let's grant that. But fast forward then to much, much later, and you have what you discover, this 50-page letter by Lasalle-Bordes, filled with detail, but also angry and vituperative and bitter and frustrated. So I guess that it's so interesting in a way to speculate as to what happened to Lasalle-Bordes. And in a sense, what happened was that he became overtaken by a sort of disciple's bitterness of betrayal. And because arguably you could say, all right, he didn't get these Paris commissions, but he could have done something else after. Right? But he didn't. And that's, see, so what happens to Lasalle-Bordes is he looks back and he sees this one moment as definitively excluding him from having a successful career. And he gets locked into sort of disciple syndrome.
Exactly. And he returned to Toulouse with a very sad mood, in a sad mood.
Yeah, and in a way it's psychically generated. It's not empirically demonstrable that this block by Delacroix definitively cancels out Lasalle-Bordes' career, because he, it might have been a short-term block, but later he could have, later something else would come up, or so on and so forth. But he transforms this event into this defining, disabling.
Yes, it's a narrative too,
which is totally fascinating.
It is proper narrative. The narrative of the échec, the not succeed,
fall.
The fall.
And just to add to that, because the other student who we feature in the show, and this perhaps maybe the one and only time he is featured in an exhibition, is Louis de Planay's extremely somewhat unsatisfying copy after the massacre at Chios. And actually, Louis de Planay did have a sort of abbreviated career and a salon exhibiting career, and he was commented upon by Baudelaire even favorably. I've actually seen several of his paintings, and I have to say they're completely underwhelming. But the whole problem, as you so, I think, engrossingly explore in your essay of how or if Delacroix actually did have students in the conventional sense, or if they were capable, how much did he impart to them such that they could evolve into their own artistic selves? And I mean, I think the still central question that people are even afraid to ask is what we do make of the public grand decorations, because I do think it is probably quite true that much of them are not by the hand of Delacroix. Now, the dessin, the idea, the composition, all of that, definitively, it is Delacroix. But when he's no longer retouching at all because he's too weak to get up the scaffolding to do so, the great Lyon version of the Marcus Aurelius is a collaborative work. The artist actually comes through and retouches the entire surface after the composition has been laid out by Louis de Planay. So in that case, you can sort of see how the touch of Delacroix is somehow rescuing the compromised part of the collaboration. But if the public decorations are actually literally, and this is where I kind of sympathize with Lasalle-Bordes, just at the hand of the artisan, in this case, the poor, I think of him as a llama, practically, then, I mean, what do you make of those things? Because really, the quality of them can't stand up to the earlier collaborative work. And no one does talk about these things, and I think it is because of the romantic myth of Delacroix, the genius. No one wants to actually come out and say some of these things are quite mediocre. I just said it. maybe some of the things that we can take up in your talk, because we're also going to be talking more about the students. And I think, are we at time now? I just don't want to. Oh, please do go ahead.
Okay, so I want to go back to maybe another thing that Lasalle-Bordes, or another way Lasalle-Bordes made his own bed, because in some ways what he didn't figure out was that originality was becoming such an important thing, and that now the artist had to take responsibility for the whole work of art, and so much so now that, you know, the help of assistants had to be erased, even more so than with David or earlier artists. So I guess, you know, in that sense I'm asking, is that another thing that Lasalle-Bordes got wrong? But maybe it's something that Delacroix got right increasingly, because I mean, there is no question that with the Palais Bourbon, that so much of it is the work of assistants. It's actually very well documented, since we have, you know, multiple testimony about who did the different pendentives. And now with your discovery, we know that, I fully believe that the Luxembourg was a lot of Lasalle's handiwork. But Delacroix seems to have tried to put more and more of his own hand into his later mural paintings. I mean, I think that was one of the discoveries of the cleaning of the Apollo ceiling, that even though that's so huge, that he actually worked on it, you know, in his frail health himself. And then, of course, with Sensible Peace, there again, he seems to have done a lot of work on it himself. We'll never know what he did on the Hôtel de Ville. But so maybe Delacroix himself kind of understood, you know, it's important that I myself start taking, have some claim to the touche in all of these things. And I wonder, it's a question, I suppose. I'm thinking, you know, in his trip in Belgium, when he goes to Belgium to see Rubens, and he's looking at Rubens, he knows, you know, that Rubens had lots of assistants too, but he's always keying in on, oh, this part was really done by Rubens, and this is, you know, a really great part, or why does Rubens do this? You know, this is where Rubens is weak, and he's seeing it all as much as he can as Rubens' own handiwork. So the question, I suppose, is maybe Delacroix himself is sort of changing with the times and realizing that, you know, maybe in the modern settlement, I have to have a bigger, at least as much as is possible, a bigger hand in the whole thing.
I'm not sure to have well understand the question. C'est Rubens, en fait, oui. Oui, le voiture de Rubens. Oui, oui. Ah oui, oui, c'est ça. Donc, mais it's the same. Because I spoke about Renaissance master, but I could have spoke about Rubens. It's the same. It's not the old masters. Rubens was an old master for him.
Although it's kind of interesting in terms of modern museological practice and the reception of Rubens, that we actually do spend a great deal of time trying to distinguish between things that are all by Rubens and things that are collaborative and things that are copies by. So, you know, our value system obviously has now keyed into a more modern kind of obsession with the original touch of the hand of the master. So we're sort of complicit in muddying the waters, I guess you could say.
Well, you brought up Svetlana Alpers, so that's a good model about Rembrandt. You know, it starts off with this problem of attribution. It's like the Polish writer, not. And then everybody goes in the crisis mode, but then she describes, well, this is the peculiarity of his practice, is instituting these facture, not clones, but people that are emulating him in a way with the particular notion of facture. And so that's why I think the Rubens is very specific regard. I mean, he's known David in terms of disegno as being the kind of core. It's about this application, the touche, a kind of the persistence of touche, you know, or a kind of delegating touche is a very specific kind of problem. I mean, it's a nightmare for connoisseurship because but it is about a kind of it's trying to establish a practice that that is collaborative, as you were saying.
I think we'll probably move on now, but thank you so much, Anne. That was terrific. And thank you, Todd.